talk on the knowledge development box, so the newly introduced IP regime that's brought in for 2016. And finally, I want to close with sort of our experience with Irish Revenue, so what we're seeing Irish Revenue go after on audits. So just in terms of the current environment, I guess, it's fair to say that all of this is overpinned by our Irish statutory 12.5% tax rate. That's the cornerstone of Irish tax policy. But in terms of looking at your R&D projects, there's a number of things you should think about in terms of the roadmap of how to map that out. So before you even start spending money on research and development, have a think about, well, is there agencies out there that can help you from a grant data perspective? There's Enterprise Ireland, there's IGA, there's a number of agencies out there that can really help you in terms of funding research and development activities. But the key for that is you need to make sure that you're doing that before you incur any expenditure. Okay, so make sure that you're talking to those agencies up front before you actually engage in your research and development activity. The next piece then is, after you start doing your research and development and spending money on research and development, you can actually get 25% of that back in cash. Okay, as I said, it's a tax credit scheme, but it's cash refundable, and a lot of companies actually miss out on that fact. So it doesn't matter if you've spent a load of money on research and development, aren't making any profits at this point in time, and therefore aren't paying tax on those profits. The money that you're investing in research and development, you can get a quarter of that back in cash. If you're spending on intangible assets, so if you're acquiring intellectual property for the purpose of your business, you can actually write that off from a tax perspective. And I'm going to touch on the knowledge development box as well, which is effectively a mechanism to have the tax on your profits from the exploitation of certain specified intangible assets, namely copyrighted software and patents. In terms of the island of Ireland and how we're doing, it's fair to say that without a shadow of a doubt, we're punching way above our weight. We're bringing in the brightest and best talent from all across the world, and that's helping to attract more R&D investment into the state. What's that doing? There's numerous announcements on a daily basis in terms of companies opening up centres of excellence, opening up research and development centres all across the country, with the one common theme of creating jobs. There's an awful lot of jobs being created in the research and development area, and a lot of that is down to the ability to actually get some valuable funding for that research and development, be it through grant aid, be it through getting money back in cash from Irish Revenue through the R&D tax credit scheme. Just very quickly in terms of the R&D tax credit regime, I'm assuming a lot of people are pretty familiar with it. Effectively, it's one scheme with two options. So if you're profitable and you're paying Irish tax, your R&D tax credit just simply gets credited against your corporate tax liability. Or if you're in a loss-making position, that R&D tax credit gets converted into a cash refund scheme. And that cash refund is effectively payable over a 3-year period. In terms of the type of costs that are eligible, and I guess this is where there's real teeth to this regime. There's a lot of sort of overhead type costs that can potentially qualify. We'll see later on that Irish Revenue are starting to squeeze the base a little bit in terms of what costs previously qualify. Their attitude is that no longer does qualify. But in general terms, I guess it's a fully loaded regime. So it's not just the salary costs of your people that are doing the research and development. It's the facility costs that those R&D folks are housed in to actually complete their R&D activities. So it's your light, it's your heat, it's your rent, it's your rates, it's the overall facility costs that you can link to your R&D activity. So while your number may start off quite small, it can actually mushroom pretty damn quickly. And remember, that mushroomed number, you get 25% of that back in cash. Effectively, this is how you can have the cost of doing your R&D in Ireland. So if you've got a qualifying project that, say, costs you 100 and qualifies for grant aid at 20%. Now, I appreciate 20% might be a little bit high, but I'm picking 20% because the math is easy. So you have an R&D project that initially costs you 100. Less your 20% grant aid gives you net of grant aid spend of 80. You have your CT, that's your corporate tax deduction of 12.5%, plus your 25% cash refund. So a project that initially cost you 100 now costs you 50. That's the one slide that we use as a business in terms of helping Irish companies to sell the idea to their US parents or to their parents scattered around the world. when the parent company sees this, and they see that you can actually have the cost of doing R&D in Ireland, that is creating an explosion of investment into Ireland. Because more often than not, particularly with the multinational companies, the Irish site isn't necessarily competing with the third-party competitors. More often it's competing with its Chinese affiliate, with its US affiliate, with its Polish affiliate. And the fact that you can have the cost of doing R&D in Ireland makes Ireland a hell of a lot more competitive on an international scale. I'm going to talk briefly on the Knowledge Development Box. So this is basically the IP regime that was brought in for 2016 and beyond. It effectively offers companies an ability to have your corporation tax rate on profits arising from the exploitation of qualifying assets. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to talk around patents and copyrighted software. There's other stuff that does qualify around plant breeders' rights and other things, but it's fair to say that the majority of this regime is geared towards patents and copyrighted software. The Irish Revenue, the Irish Department of Finance, and general Irish government have been marketing our Knowledge Development Box as the first OECD compliant Knowledge Development Box regime. So what the OECD have done across member countries is they've looked at all the various patent boxes within their member states, and they've effectively concluded that every single one of them isn't compliant with their laws. So in some form or the other, all the other patent regimes across the world are going to have to change the rules associated with their patent box regime. Not Ireland. Ireland is the very first one that's going to be compliant from an OECD perspective. How can you benefit? And this is the beauty about the Knowledge Development Box. It's not the Knowledge Development Box or the R&D tax credit. It's the R&D tax credit and the Knowledge Development Box. So in order to qualify for the Knowledge Development Box, you have to qualify for your 25% cash refund scheme. Okay, so it's a bolt-on to your R&D tax credit scheme. So effectively, you have to be carrying on R&D activities in the EEA. That's what the rules say. Effectively, it's bums on seats in Ireland. Okay, but the rules are there's a territoriality restriction for the EEA. But it's fair to say that generally speaking, when you run through the various pieces of the legislation, it's effectively bums on seats in Ireland, which gives rise to so that R&D has to qualify for the R&D tax credit. That R&D has to lead to the creation or the development of a patent or a copyrighted software, because I mentioned there that they're the types of assets that qualify for your KDB scheme. You effectively carve out a separate P&L as such for your Knowledge Development Box scheme, so you need to attribute an income stream to the sales proceeds of what you're selling from a patent or a copyrighted software perspective. You need to track your R&D expenditure, so you've sales proceeds less your cost gives effectively your profits, and that's effectively taxed at half of the 12.5% rate. Okay, so as I said, it's a bolt-on to your R&D tax credit scheme. There's a formula in terms of how you calculate various different things, and this is probably more onerous for the multinational companies. So if you're an SME or an Irish Indigenous company, and all you're doing is research and development, and you're not outsourcing any R&D to a group company, or you're not acquiring intellectual property, so you're not spending capital sums on intellectual property, your formula is effectively 1/1. Okay? For the multinationals, where a lot of them, they would outsource portions of their R&D activity, that portion falls into the denominator. Where you acquire intellectual property from third parties or from other sources, that falls into the numerator as well. So to the extent that you're a multinational and you acquire capital IP, or you outsource a portion of your R&D, that can erode the benefit associated with the KDB. Effectively, so that's your formula. You multiply it by your profit, and whatever answer you get, you tax them at 6.25% as opposed to 12.5%. That's a quick run through in terms of the R&D tax credit scheme and I guess the Knowledge Development Box. The final point I want to sort of finish on is what we're seeing in terms of Irish revenue. And there's a lot of talk going on in the media as to what Irish revenue are doing. Recent media reports suggested that revenue are throwing back more than €20 million per annum from companies who are overclaiming R&D tax benefits. So they're either claiming costs that they shouldn't be claiming for, or indeed they don't have the documentation to say what they're doing and evidence that fact. So we're seeing revenue come in more often than not these days to actually claw back money from companies that are claiming the R&D tax credit. When the regime was first brought in 2004, there was less than 50 companies claiming this R&D tax credit. Last year there was more than 1,600 companies claiming this R&D tax credit. So you can imagine that Irish Revenue have been inundated with an explosion of activity and an explosion of companies claiming the R&D tax credit. They're paying out more than €500 million per annum these days, so they have to be seen to be policing this scheme. And as a result, the level of audit activity is starting to go up, the level of clawbacks is starting to go up. So what I would say is just make sure you've got the right supporting documentation in place before you actually put the claims into Irish Revenue. Not surprisingly, as the level and volume of R&D tax claims are being filed with Revenue are on the rise, so too is the level and volume of Irish Revenue audit activity. It's a high-risk area. You're effectively knocking on Irish Revenue's door, asking for a big chunky cheque. Expect that Irish Revenue are going to come knocking on your door saying, I'd like to see the supporting documentation to back that up, please. There's no such thing as a free lunch. Revenue aren't going to pay out the cheque willy-nilly without actually doing some checking of the numbers and checking of the various rules. One of the contentious areas is that Revenue keep on publishing new guidelines despite the fact that the law hasn't bloody well changed. And this is a real sort of bone of contention within the industry. So the 2011 guidelines there suggest that there's various things that previously did qualify. So, for example, maintenance, finance and personnel costs, maintaining R&D equipment, taking on and paying R&D staff. So that was in the 2011 Revenue guidelines that basically said this is the type of stuff that qualifies for your R&D tax credit. Revenue have now come along in 2015 and said, actually, this type of stuff doesn't qualify. So the types of costs that don't qualify are effectively equipment repairs or maintenance, recruitment fees, and various other things. So there's a little bit of uncertainty out in the community as to what type of costs do qualify versus what type of costs don't. I should sort of emphasise the point that there's a big caveat on the front page of the Irish Revenue's guidelines that says this is not a legal document. Placing any reliance on this document, you do so at your own risk. So, the law has not changed in this respect. It's just Revenue's interpretation of what that law is. So what I would say to you is, if you're looking at the various costs within your particular business, and you're going down through it to see, what type of costs you can say actually are directly related to your R&D activity, bear that in mind and relate that back to the law and not necessarily the guidelines. Of course, the guidelines are going to be persuasive in terms of where Irish Revenue will likely target on an audit, but just bear that in mind that it's not a legal document. There are various types of audits that can carry out. So there's the bog standard financial audit. So your revenue inspector will toddle out and tick and bash the numbers, look at your supporting documentation in terms of your invoices, your payroll records, all that type of good stuff, and effectively make sure that you've got the right supporting documentation in place. Then there's the technical audit, and we're seeing more and more of this these days. And this is where Irish Revenue will effectively outsource that particular audit to a college professor within your field. Okay, so the process is they will write to you as Mr. CFO or Mr. CTO or Mr. Tax Person and say, we're proposing to use Professor X from UCD, UCC, UL. I know there's loads of universities here, I'm not going to name them all off. So they'll effectively outsource that science test review to a college professor in your field. And what they'll do is the college professor will come out with the revenue inspector, and the college professor will look at your R&D activities and the documentation and effectively sign off as to whether that is a qualifying R&D activity. Irish Revenue cannot do that. Despite the fact they've tried, they cannot do that. Irish Revenue do not have the expertise to say, yes, you're doing R&D, or more importantly, no, you're not doing R&D. So it's very important that you're aware of that. When Irish Revenue write out to you to say we're proposing to use a certain professor, it's up to you as a business to vet that individual first. Okay? And it's not going to be finance or tax people that are going to be doing that. It's going to be your R&D folks. So your R&D folks should understand who that particular college professor is and do a little bit of vetting and due diligence around that individual to make sure that A, he or she fits the bill, and more importantly, there isn't a conflict of interest. So in other words, you haven't annoyed that particular individual in a previous life. Generally speaking, Irish Revenue will get it right in terms of matching the college professor with your area of expertise. So they're not going to send out a chemist to audit a technology claim. They generally do tend to get it pretty right. But I would say the onus is on you as a business to make sure that you vet that individual first. What are the factors, I guess, that influence audit selection? I threw this slide up there a while ago when I was speaking at an Irish Tax Institute conference, and I knew that a lot of the people in the room were actually revenue inspectors, but I said to hell with it, I'll throw it up anyway and see if I get a reaction. I didn't get any reaction, so I reckon I'm there or thereabouts. But generally speaking, and this is common sense type stuff, so generally speaking, what are the key factors that influence you getting selected for a revenue audit? Well, no surprise that the size of the claim is going to be one, and that's probably going to be the biggest. And Revenue have audited the vast majority of the biggest claims, and they are gradually working their way down through that list. Are you claiming for cash, or are you just simply claiming as a credit? So if you're knocking on Revenue's door asking for a cheque, the likelihood is you're going to get audited at some stage. What's your track record like with Revenue? Are you a compliant taxpayer? Do you have a good relationship with your Revenue inspector? Is there a particular project going on at a district level in Revenue? So, for example, is the Dublin district going to someday decide and go, we're going to carry out R&D audits across the whole spectrum of our clients within Dublin who have filed R&D claims? And they've done that in certain jurisdictions before, regardless of the size of your claim. What are your responses like to the questions that Revenue are starting to pose ad hoc? So, there's a 23-point list of questions that Revenue generally issue upon submission of an R&D claim. If you don't get that particular submission right, in terms of making sure that it's adequately prepared, the likelihood is that tends to lead to a revenue audit as well. And the industry sector that you're in. What we're seeing is there's a lot of companies within the technology sector that are being audited simply because A, the volume of technology companies that are claiming is far outweighs all other industry sectors, but also there seems to be a bit of grey as to what type of activity qualifies versus what type of activity doesn't from an R&D perspective. So there's quite a bit of subjectivity there. I guess our biggest experience with Revenue is that the more adequately prepared you are for a revenue audit, the easier you're going to have it. If you aren't that prepared, it can go on, and it can go on and on. I've been involved in audits that have lasted 2 days. I've been involved in audits that have lasted more than 2.5 years. And that is not an exaggeration. These audits can take a lot of senior management time, not just from your R&D folks, but also from your finance and tax folks as well. So if you get it right up front and you put in place the adequate preparation, generally speaking, you tend to sail through these. But as I said, just make sure that you're adequately prepared for these audits. And I guess finally how we can help. So, we have a team of scientists and engineers that can come out and help assess whether you're doing the right stuff from an R&D perspective. We've also got a team on hand to help assess whether the knowledge development box is favourable from your perspective as well. And we've also, as most people are probably familiar with our Entrepreneur of the Year brand, the entries for that actually close as it happens this week. And the EOI brand very much supports innovative, growing, entrepreneurial style companies. And we have a number of people here today at our stand, which is just out there, who could talk to you around what the EOI can do for you and how you can actually apply for the EOI program. I'm more than happy to take any questions now. I'm conscious that there's probably a little bit of time lag here, so if anybody does have any questions as well, I'll be around at the stand as well, so by all means come and talk to me. Thanks very much.